This presentation is going to be about our brains as the path to better AI. Got one human brain on the left, outsmarting one of the great giants in the field of deep neural networks, Geoffrey Hinton, outwitting our hardware guys, and the caricature for them is going to be GPUs. And then we've got just the deep neural network in general, multi-layer perceptron. Orgel's second rule is that evolution is cleverer than you. Leslie Orgel was an evolutionary chemist. He was one of the first people that Watson and Crick shared their model of DNA with. To back this claim up a little bit, all of these very deep central problems plaguing modern deep neural networks have solutions that the brain discovered through evolution. Us humans don't need a lot of training examples. We don't forget how to do one task when we learn another. We can leverage old learning to learn new things faster. Goal alignment for us isn't too hard, right? That's part of what laws are for. We can talk to each other. We're interpretable, even if it is just folk psychology a lot of the time. But we have common sense. This is just something we pick up. We're kind of obligate common sensors and obligate culturers at this point. And that's what the second point is, creating new knowledge. We can combine multiple senses and make more robust world models. It's harder to fool us. And we do task and motion planning, and last but not least, network architecture search. So this is called NAS. This is from deep neural network land. This is just essentially the wiring diagram. What's connected to what? And if there's any kind of cell structure or modularity that can be repeated and leveraged, how to do that. That's what NAS deals with. Okay, so let's look at evolutionary design that's already worked its way into the field of deep neural networks. Some of these are going to be by accident or some more purposeful, like Louis Lepique's point neuron model that goes all the way back to 1907. So he was looking at a real neuron and trying to mathematically model it. We'll go into more detail in a few slides. And then there was, in 1958, Frank Rosenblatt's Perceptron. This also had evolutionary design principles. It was a modern predecessor of deep neural networks, and you can see the actual hardware implementation he made on the right. It's pretty parallel, just like the brain. It's not as parallel as the hardware we have nowadays, but it was one of the first to really stress the importance of parallel architecture and parallel processing. And the weights of the model, the parameters, the things that are configurable that make the learning possible, is adjustable. Here they would be potentiometers with variable resistance. And then the Perceptron also used a heaviside step activation function. So without going into too much detail, this is just how the inputs of a neuron would get mapped to the output. And it's kind of a very quick binary switching. It's either on or off and very little in between for a very short duration of time. And then reinforcement learning also has an interesting background with biology and neuroscience. Sutton and Barto are considered to be two grand figures in the field of reinforcement learning. Their work in the 80s really kicked off when they were using classical conditioning as data to drive their models. They were trying to model specifically a system that would exhibit classical conditioning behavior. And this is behavior like what you'd train your dogs with. You should be thinking Pavlov's dogs. All that type of stuff is a lot of classical conditioning. And a decade later, in the 90s, some neuroscientists discovered that the brain might be implementing reinforcement learning in the dopamine system. And these guys also helped contribute some convergence proofs of Q-learning, some optimality proofs. This image here on the right is the basal ganglia in green, and just a small part of the basal ganglia includes most of the dopamine projecting neurons in your brain. Projecting meaning just sending signals, and they will send far-reaching signals, not just within the green area highlighted in this image. And the last evolutionary design principles we'll talk about come from the neocognitron, which was made by Fukushima in 1979. He was a Japanese researcher. And he introduced convolutional and downsampling layers. These were directly inspired by Hubel and Wiesel's work on the visual neocortex of cats. So they would show simple visual elements on a slide projector to cats that were anesthetized and forced to stare straight ahead, and record in a certain part of the visual cortex of cats, specifically very early on in processing, getting input from the eyes. And they made a theoretical model of how those signals would later be combined. That model was applied in Fukushima's work, and with great success, because when you add backprop and use the sigmoid activation function, which Jan LeCun did, you get pretty much modern convolutional neural networks. And building on that yet again, AlexNet changed the sigmoid activation function to a ReLU activation function and went even more parallel than the Perceptron went by using graphics cards or GPUs. The rest of this talk is going to mainly be about pushing our intuitions and making us ask ourselves if backprop, sigmoid activation functions, and ReLU activation functions are biologically inspired or not. And subsequently, we can ask ourselves if we should care. If our human brains are the goal, we should look at our current models and see how they can be improved. This is what AlexNet did. The senior author on the paper was Geoffrey Hinton, who we've got a picture of again here. On the right, the real thing. We've got the real Neuron and real Jeff Hinton. And then on the left, we've got a caricature, a model, the point neuron model. This is that model that's been around since 1907. And we've got the model of Geoffrey Hinton, or what have you, a caricature. And I liken today's neural networks to caricatures of the real neurons. When you dig into the history, it's not that contentious at all. So some weights are learned, and so these arrows on the left, these blue arrows, might get smaller or bigger and change size, or maybe even if the weights become negative, you can imagine them even changing color, and they would become inhibitory neurons. All of these weights multiplied by inputs get summed, and then an activation function changes whatever the summed input is into the output. The same thing on the right is going on. The dendrites represent the inputs, and the axons represent the outputs. And the summation and the activation function happen here at the base of the axon, called the axon hillock, and also where the trigger zone is. So this is where the summation and the transformation of the summed input to the outputs will actually be happening in the real biological neurons. We're going to focus here at this activation function because that's what one of AlexNet's contributions was. And it changed the sigmoid activation function to the ReLU, and we can see them here. I did a little bit of digging to try to figure out why we use sigmoids in the first place. There doesn't seem to be too much bioplausibility. It seems more plausible that because it was differentiable, it could be used in backpropagation, which is the standard way, of course, in deep neural networks, how to train the weights, which requires that the activation functions be differentiable. And you can easily interpret the output of a sigmoid as a probability. And why would you change it to a ReLU? Why would you want to change from a sigmoid to a ReLU? Well, at least two reasons. There are faster derivative calculations for backpropagation as you get rid of the exponential in the sigmoid, and the ReLU's derivatives are very simple. On the left of 0, the derivative is 0, and it's 1 on the right side of 0. And ReLU solves vanishing gradient problems that suffers sigmoids and other stretched version of sigmoid like tan-H or what have you. And the problem here is that at the extremes where this is kind of flat, the derivative is 0, just like over here in ReLU, right? Even just having one of these will diminish your signal quite a bit. Your error gets multiplied by the derivative of this sigmoid. And so if your input is at one of these extremes where the derivative is 0, your error signal gets squished, gets made very small, and thus your updates in your parameter space tend to be too small as well. You don't get very good sample efficiency. If you get rid of vanishing gradients, you get better sample efficiency, so convergence in training happens faster. And training in general is going to be faster because you've gotten rid of those exponentials in the derivative calculations. It's worth noting the heaviside step activation function that the Perceptron used is arguably most biologically plausible. Should we go back? We'd have to get rid of backpropagation and implement something else. Because, as you can see here, the derivative is undefined as it is a step function at 0. The other thing that AlexNet is famous for is introducing GPUs into the training process. So they had 2 of these graphics cards here, which back in the day would have cost about $1,000. And AlexNet trained on a combined 6 gigabytes of video RAM for 6 days. Only 7 years later, due to the mainstream interest and just grants pouring into this type of research, the University of Oregon State, which is only half the size of the University of Toronto, where the inventors of AlexNet were, and Oregon State also has half of the operating budget of the University of Toronto as well. Even with that in mind, Oregon State was able to, 7 years later, invest $2.6 million and get unheard of compute in 2012. just in this one photo, you have 3,000 gigabytes of video RAM. And I'm planting a flag here so that us software guys know that the hardware guys are really kicking our butts and have a lot to be proud of. And I don't think we need killer hardware to make progress in our software. A lot of hype is generated from growing as much compute as you can get your hands on, and almost any of these deep neural networks scale with compute if you also increase the data set as well. I think this is no longer trivial, and I think we should have standards where we use much less data and much less compute and compare apples to apples. This figure can kind of show you why I say this. This could give you a good example of why I want us to have compute standards. So here's AlexNet. You see why it got famous. Look at this slope. And just one competition year into the next, the accuracy of any solution on classifying ImageNet jumped from about 50% to 65%. But as we've seen, AlexNet trained for 6 days on 6 gigabytes of video RAM for about $1,000. The best as of last year, which is another 25% better. This EfficientNet L2 trained for 6 days on a TPU pod cluster. It had almost 100 times as much video RAM and compute as did training AlexNet. Just to replicate this would cost $37,000 in rented compute. You wouldn't even own it like the $1,000 would get you back in 2012. So this is to say, yet again, let's make sure us software guys aren't patting ourselves on the back for improved hardware. I think the software side of things are far from done yet. And then I would like to ask you guys, where did the time go? I'm not trying to get you guys to have an existential crisis with me. I'm really asking, how did we get from what real neurons do here in this big graph? This kind of shows over time what the output of an individual neuron is. And then we somehow got the ReLU. Where did the time go, and why is this justified to not include time in our input and output axes like real neurons do? Okay, so I've kind of planted the motivating question. I'm going to go into a little more detail about what we're seeing here on the screen. The input voltage to an individual neuron is shown below. The original time here on the left, there's no DC current input, and then we're slowly ramping it up. And this black bar down here represents 20 milliseconds. We'll see some more figures like this where the input-output relationship is different for different cells. And you might notice that this black bar is going to be either elongated or shortened, but it's always marking 20 milliseconds. And it does look like ReLU behaves like this class 1 excitable neuron. But you got to look at it the right way. You got to look at it like a rate encoding, which means the average firing frequency of this neuron. ReLUs, you keep turning up the input, and at some point it turns on. And then it's a linear relationship from there. This is what we're seeing here. There is some input in the beginning of this neuron, but it doesn't turn on. It's got to get pretty high, and then it does fire. And you can see the frequency gets higher and higher as the input continues to be increased. So this might be the answer to my question, where did the time go? It might be that ReLUs are essentially the average firing rate of a neuron. And that way the time isn't really necessary because the same information can be encoded as an averaged time window, right? The firing frequency at any given moment can be interpreted as the output. But there's a problem with this, or I guess bad news. I think it's great news. Maybe we can make the connection between some tricks the brain has and between tricks we found in artificial neural network land. And the bad news is there's at least 19 other types of input-output relationships, input-to-output mappings that we know of that exist in the brain as well, besides class 1 excitable neurons. I'll give you some examples of what these other ones are doing. Let's look at M. This is an interesting one. You actually, instead of exciting the cell, you apply a negative voltage, yet it still rebounds and spikes, and that's how it gets its name. This is rather odd. This really questions the purpose of inhibitory cells, I think. K is a resonator where we give 2 inputs at one time on the left, and it doesn't cause a spike, but we separate them on the right, and it does cause a spike. This is the fact that the spacing between the incoming signals can make all the difference, right? So that's why it's called a resonator. The phase, and whether it is in phase or out of phase, makes a difference. And the integrator is kind of the exact opposite relationship. The closer they are, the more certain it is to fire. And this is great for a coincidence detection. R, maybe the last one we'll look at, the accommodation, is if you slowly ramp up the input voltage, the cell membrane will actually accommodate, it will adjust and expect it. So you notice even though the input's increasing, it's staying relatively flat. And then if you back off the input, the cell membrane potential goes back down. And then a spike occurs immediately after a sharp input voltage. Notice the slow ramp on the left, the long one, did not trigger an action potential, a spike, but the short one did, and that's because its slope was much greater. And this is called the accommodator. So at a high level, I'm interested in learning more about if this interpretation is correct. If that ReLU is making an average firing rate and that it's differentiable and we can find a sweet spot in the parameters. I would like to know if we can train any of these other ones with backpropagation, and if not, how to add more of these together and combine them in kind of our normal search space way that we think about in computer science. We have found one great solution in this search space, but there are another 19 potentially that we can keep playing with and discover. And when we do put time back in it, there are some interesting ways to consider how the information could be encoded in those time signals. Time to spike is one such method where the stimulus occurs, and then the difference in time between that stimulus and the first neuron to respond to it, that delta is encoding all of the important information. The neurons that respond to the stimulus later do not encode any information. That is an assumption of time to first spike, temporal coding methods. Rank order coding is another spike coding method. This is where it's thought that the relative firing order carries all the information. So neuron 3 fires first, so it's given order number 1. Neuron 1 fires second, etc., etc. And this numbering from top to bottom conveys some information, and there's 5 factorial different combinations or bits of informational states here that can be represented. And then latency coding is another popular one that has the potential to have a large amount of information bandwidth. It's the idea that the information is encoded between spikes. So this is similar to that first one we saw, but instead of only the first spike mattering, every delta t between subsequent spikes is important and can carry information. So we've already kind of been hinting at it, but now we're there. And I call this backprop of the gaps because Geoffrey Hinton, since the 1980s, since he started popularizing error backpropagation for learning these weights in deep neural networks, he's been trying to find something that looks like backprop in our brains. And in 2019, to show, he's still thinking along these lines, he said, I think it'd be crazy if the brain was not somehow doing this, doing something like backprop. And we should think of what I opened with. We should think of Orgel's second rule. Just because somebody as clever and as brilliant as Geoffrey Hinton can't imagine another way that evolution would solve this problem of updating weights doesn't make it so. Evolution is cleverer than you. Another famous scientist's quote comes to mind when I think of Geoffrey Hinton trying to prescribe backprop to the brain. And that is an epistemological lesson with Richard Feynman. And this is how we're going to close. He said, nature is there and she's going to come out the way she is. Therefore, when we go to investigate her, we shouldn't pre-decide what it is we're trying to do, besides learn more about her. Thank you.